everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Quick introduction from me to start. I'm Lauren. My career actually spans predominantly across talent acquisition across the last decade or so. But in the last kind of year, my role has kind of broadened out to be more people partnering, but also working with our clients at AssessFirst, who are of course talent acquisition leads. So my role is to support them with their onboarding and kind of ongoing client success, which hopefully positions me quite well to talk today, really about the research that AssessFirst has done in this space, and then of course working with Aasha to get more of a boots on the ground perspective, really. So yeah, over to you.
Yep. So I'm Aasha. I'm head of talent acquisition currently at Spencer Ogden. So I've got about a decade in industry. Actually, the first half was in actual recruitment agency side before I moved over to talent acquisition. So I have that lens of recruiting from all aspects, whether it's external or internal. I specialize predominantly in the early career market as well as some experience, but that's my main wheelhouse.
Awesome. So yeah, today we are gonna really kind of talk through from two lenses. We appreciate that for people on these types of webinars, it's just so important for you to get the lived experience really of other TA leads such as Asha in the space, as opposed to just hearing vendors like myself talk about it. So we want to make today as relevant for you guys as possible. So what we're going to do is kind of talk about the research that AssessFirst has conducted into this space, what we know about algorithms and the benefits it can actually bring to helping overcome and reduce gender bias. So we'll talk about the current landscape from the research perspective, but also from what that actually kind of plays out like in the day to day. We're going to look at how AI can reduce human bias in our processes, some real world application of that, and then finishing on AI and the candidate experience, and what we've seen to make us an impact basically from that perspective. So I'm going to hand over to Asha first of all. It'd just be great to hear kind of over your years of experience, really, like what AI in your processes has looked like, and maybe where you've seen that bias show up, and what has led you to want to use AI to help combat gender bias in your processes.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, I come at this from just probably actually very recently reviewed our entire process at Spencer Ogden to see where we can remove bias or where bias was existing in our process, but also recently as like a job seeker in the TA market,
Mm.
being on the flip side of that from a candidate and seeing, I guess, the good, the bad, and the ugly of how AI is used in a lot of people's, process. So I think for me, it starts all the way at the very beginning with like your job descriptions or job adverts, like just making sure there is no like gender coded language in it, because it essentially feeds into everything else. So, especially for me, I think the big one is using AI right at the beginning of that sifting. And I think when we saw that poll, when you have a lot of applications, it's really tempting to do that. But ultimately, it's all about the information you're feeding into it. So your job descriptions, your advertisements, if they've already got gender bias, that's going into the AI sifting algorithms. Same for the competency frameworks, if you're using that to match keywords, etc. That's all compounding essentially the bias that AI is using. Specifically for us as well, we operate heavily in that early career space. So quite often like CVs and experiences are relevant for us. We are looking for those soft skills, those natural behaviors and people's drivers, which again is not necessarily something that, a pure generic AI algorithm can, I guess, sift from a CV. You need that kind of human touch. And I guess the last one that, regardless of industry or level of hiring you have, your that gender affinity bias actually in the interview process from our
Mhm.
hiring managers, from the interviewers, feedback and all of those parts. So it does show up, I think, at every stage, all bias, not just gender bias, but I think that's the predominant one that we see, or the most obvious one, the one that we're most comfortable talking about, perhaps. That one does come up at every stage. So it's really around taking each stage. And what you'll find actually, and again, because this was the number one on the poll, is by starting to think of things through the lens of how can I remove the gender bias, you will automatically start removing other biases as well, which will hopefully in turn, have an uptick in your general diversity hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think the kind of key takeaway at the moment is like everyone's trying so hard to make our processes like more efficient. We're trying to save money, we're trying to improve the candidate experience, but we really need to be really careful about what solutions we're bringing in to make sure that we're not kind of harming one area when we're helping another. And like AI is an area that is very new to people, especially like trusting AI to have such a huge impact on our processes. So what we'll kind of explore today is understanding what actually feeds that AI, because that's what comes down to the bias. And as you've said, if you've got the language in a job description, you are using a tool, which we've got a stat on in just a second, that CV sifts that actually perpetuates bias, then you're not going to be doing yourself or the gender diversity in your team any favors. Was that something that you've like experienced particularly at Spencer Ogden at all?
I mean, they were pretty far forward when I came here. There was definitely stuff in the process that I did remove like immediately. So they were using an AI tool as the CV sifting. They also were doing one-way video interviewing,
Mhm.
which again is I'm not a fan of in terms of bias. But I think the overarching thing for me is, and this word gets used a lot in lots of different kind of, it's almost a systemic nature of it, right? We know
Yeah.
that there is a gender imbalance at leadership and board level and at your management level. So these are generally the people that are involved in building the stages or building the interview
Mm,
questions or building the JD. So it is that compounding, you're breeding that systemic
true.
bias into all of the processes. So, sometimes you do need somebody from outside to take a look, or you need to, have a like a horizontal peer group where you can actually
Hmm.
like just run things past, because
Yeah.
it is that just it's compound interest of all the way from
Yeah.
the top coming through.
Yeah, interesting, because that leads me on very nicely. We know, and we have of course conducted a lot of research into this space, but studies from 2019 showed that even when women have equal experience and skills, they are judged harsher than men. They receive lower potential evaluations, which is contributing to this gender promotion gap. Diversity training effectiveness. I mean, lots and lots of companies put this in place, but the data shows that ultimately it can be short lived. And actually, these programs have been shown to reinforce stereotypes rather than diminish them. We have a white paper, by the way, that we will share, so you can look into all of this research in some more detail. But the statistics are showing that it's very very challenging for women to be simply just judged equally than they would be with men. There's also something called gender role congruity. And I have included a quote from Taylor Swift because it just sums it up perfectly. But it's a scientific fact that if women adopt masculine roles, they are perceived as cold and instrumental. If they adopt feminine roles, they are perceived as less competent. And this causes a gender role congruity bias, where candidates are essentially evaluated based on how well their gender aligns with the perceived gender norms of the group. So women come into a position where they are required to be more masculine, but they're immediately judged in a more harsh way, despite trying to align basically with the gender roles that are required in that position. And ultimately, what that's doing is it's negatively impacting the career advancement of women, because they're not being judged equally for men, particularly as you mentioned when it comes to those more senior level positions.
And Laura,
So
just
that's the
on that,
landscape.
there's a really good resource. It's catalyst.org that talks all about that, the language you use to describe what a woman would do instead of what a man do. There's
Nice.
like really great like cards and resources on that website that are free to download
Oh,
if
wicked.
anybody wants to have a look at it. It's called catalyst.org.
Awesome, perfect. We'll make a note of that, and we'll get that sent out in our post webinar email. Um, so we have found that when it comes to actually how we can use AI to help reduce bias, some algorithms do have the ability to level the gender playing field. And ultimately, how this kind of works is that it increases the proportion of women that are selected up to a balance of 50%. So if you're choosing the right algorithm, it can increase gender balance to be fair. And ultimately, the key thing here is that that algorithm would outperform human judgments that are being made. Because yes, we can look at the kind of bias that's perpetuated through our job descriptions or through the systemic nature of our interviews, but ultimately it is humans that are putting that bias in, not intentionally, but it's a subconscious bias that's playing out in these processes. And I always talk about the fact that the value for algorithms is that it's a neutral third party if the algorithm itself is neutral. And I often say, like, the algorithm doesn't care whether you hire somebody. The algorithm doesn't care who you hire, but it will give you that objective overview of a candidate to mean that it will challenge your own beliefs. And oftentimes, you'll see a candidate that's been selected. I was speaking to someone not long ago who said that they had 5 candidates at final stage interview, who originally, had they been judged by a human, wouldn't have even got through the first stage interview because the biases would have just told them that that person wasn't accurate. So yeah, it helps us to challenge our own beliefs essentially, and give so many candidates an opportunity to be considered. Um, Interestingly, as well, using AI, it can actually encourage women to apply for positions in those traditionally male-dominated fields, because women know that actually, if they are being judged equally by this kind of non-biased, objective algorithm, they aren't going to have biases working against them as well. Any thoughts on those at all, in terms of kind of looking at your experience and how AI can be used to actually work in the favor of reducing bias?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's around, as we said, just making sure the information we're putting in is neutralized as much as possible. And I
Hmm.
think always, you know, you have to have that balance of using AI for those reasons, for removing the gender bias. So like not even having a CV sometimes, and actually just
Yeah,
having matches based on, the things that are important to you as a business. But yeah, it's using both, I think, at the same time. For instance, like in Germany, it's actually illegal to make a hiring decision based on AI alone. So, you have to prove in your process
yeah,
that you haven't made a decision based just on AI. So
yeah,
it's the balance, especially at this stage when, as
definitely.
you said, AI is quite new, the training of it, the embedding of it, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. We shouldn't be taking these decisions lightly. And any organization who who you should trust should be able to prove why you trust them. Ultimately, and that's kind of what we believe. But we want to be, equal in this and look at, yes, AI can do a ton for reducing bias, but actually, how can it perpetuate bias? And to your point earlier, Asha, it has been found that algorithms in candidate search engines, so if you are using algorithms way, way, way at the start of your process, they are often ranking male candidates higher than female candidates. And this is a huge challenge because if a candidate can't even get their foot in the door based on the screening tool that's being used, obviously you're immediately unequaling or discouraging the fairness in that process. So there's a ton of research out there. Some of it is working to show, yes, there's a benefit for AI, but we also know that there's a lot of work to be done there as well. So when it comes to how algorithms can neutralize it, as we talk about, and hopefully this will be the key point that you'll take home today, is that the algorithms must be trained fairly. And what that means is that it shouldn't be mimicking or being trained by you as recruiters or human intuition, because ultimately it's those things that are creating the bias in the first place, whether we know it or not. And the CV is actually, as we're kind of well aware, it is a hugely biased piece of documentation. And a lot of algorithms, even very simple algorithms, if you were to remove the name of someone from a CV, and I believe the hobbies from the CV as well, the algorithm would still be able to predict the gender of that CV based on the information that's within it, even when you remove things that you think would kind of nod to the gender of that CV. So we need to be really careful about what is actually giving the algorithm information. So one type of gender blind data that can predict job performance is personality focused algorithms. And we know that this is much more likely to yield unbiased outcomes. And that is basically because personality focused algorithms do not consider gender as a way of it making its decisions. The gender of a person doesn't have an impact. And we've talked a little bit about job descriptions, and this is something that is huge because there's lots of technology solutions out there that you can use to kind of try and neutralize the language in job descriptions, which I think is amazing. But ultimately, what that is kind of looking at really is the audience. It's to make sure that when someone reads a job description, they feel that it's suitable and it's inclusive for them, as opposed to only appealing to one group of the population. But we actually take that quite a few steps forward because within AssessFirst, we basically create what is called a benchmark model, which Aasha and the team use as well, to basically create your benchmark for success when you're hiring. So this is based on personality traits and motivations and decision making. But one way of doing this is actually by looking at job descriptions. And of course, people will be thinking, well, hang on, how are you not perpetuating bias if that's what you're using internally? But the way that we do this is we have a system that basically checks for gender bias within your job descriptions. So it creates what's called a neural network that, similar to that CV algorithm we just talked about, it predicts a person's gender based on the data generated about them. So if the model can accurately predict gender, it shows there is a gender bias that needs to be fixed. So the system basically compares which part of the model are important for predicting gender and which part are important for job performance. So it removes the parts of the model that are important for predicting gender, and then just focuses on job success. So ultimately, this means that we're just looking at the parts of the job description that predict job success, as opposed to looking at any kind of gender biased information that might be in there. So there are lots of tools, and this is a great example of a way that internally at AssessFirst, artificial intelligence is being used to reduce bias in a job description. That is, of course, a key part of how people are hiring as well. Any topics or thoughts on that, Aasha?
No, 100%. I think we talk about this a little bit further on when I guess I talk about the real world applications we've done here at Spencer Ogden. But, I think that's one of the key things in any assessment or screening tool that you have is a way to personalize it, a way to remove gender
Mm-hmm.
bias and just look at the the indicators for performance within your organization, as opposed to
Yep.
more generic ones that have been built and you don't, as you said, you don't know the technology, therefore how can you trust the technology?
Yep. Yeah, exactly that. Exactly that. And like I just think we're very fortunate to be in a position now where we can tell the difference. It wasn't too long ago back in the day before my time where the gender of somebody was so tightly linked to success, where actually how cool is it that we can use technology to separate what is gender bias and what is an actual predictor of performance, to mean that people are given so many more equal opportunities by bringing technology in to help neutralize bias that could be existing in a process. So yeah, I just think that's pretty cool. So some research that AssessFirst conducted recently, we obviously we've talked a lot about gender equity in hiring and algorithms, and there are mixed results ultimately. Some studies show that we've looked at today, there can be lots of ways of improving diversity through algorithms, and we can achieve up to that 50% gender balance, but others reveal that there is still a bias towards men. Now, we believe that this bias is stemming from using gender biased CVs and data from CVs to train those algorithms. So basically, what we wanted to test is whether personality data, which is less impacted by bias and we know is a better predictor of job success, could actually improve this equity. So we did a study where we collected data from 18 employees across over 200 occupations in 21 job categories, and we created unique predictive models for these. So ultimately, what those models do is focuses on the personality traits that are most relevant to job performance. So we asked employees within these organizations to take an assessment. Their performance was rated on a scale of performance, and we basically created algorithms from that data. So ultimately, what we wanted to find was how fair these models that we'd created were in representing females and males in terms of recommending the people that were best suited to the jobs. So basically, a little bit of psychology lingo here, but what we are looking at is an impact ratio between 0.8 and 1, and that is what is considered fair. And our results show that 95% of the predictive models did meet the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission standards. And those outside of that 95%, which was only 11 models, were slightly out of that threshold. So they were slightly below the 0.8 threshold, but above the 0.7. So basically, what we came away from this kind of concluding was that the personality-based algorithms that are selected, they don't exhibit that gender bias. So if you're selecting algorithms that are being trained with appropriate data, such as personality-based information, it's going to be able to have the opportunity to enhance your hiring practices by basically selecting candidates whilst maintaining gender balance. So yeah, we were super happy with that study and with that research. I don't know if that worked a second ago. But yeah, over to the kind of real world application really of Spencer Ogden and what you guys have found.
Yeah, so She's Spencer Ogden is the second company I've used AssessFirst in. I used it in my last company as well, and seeing really similar results. I think for us, so specifically in our London office, we increased the overall diversity by 22%, but actually we increased the female population by 30%. And in North America, where generally it's harder to do these kinds of things or make impact in my experience, we increased by 11% our female balance, but actually, really importantly for us, our female leadership also increased by 6%. This happened in a number of different ways, I guess, where we use, the different metrics and assess first. So we're speeding through these figures
No, it's
here.
all right. I've just realized
No,
these figures aren't the ones that you're mentioning. So I'm just trying to
no
find.
worries.
There we
So
go.
for us, it's really about, yeah, so we are working predominantly in the early careers sector. So, a CV anyway with the bias it introduces is largely relevant for us. So we are
Yeah.
looking at some of these natural behaviors and their drivers, and being able to use Assess First and the algorithm there. So we're not using a generic, I guess, off the shelf algorithm
Mm,
of what a good salesperson or a good recruiter looks like, but we're able to build it based off their behaviors and motivators and actually put in our own employees. So we're benchmarking against our existing population. We can rank those on performance and another metric. So for us, it was based off performance and then their alignment to our core values, which are actually assessed at every stage of our performance and personal development plan. So in that way we are training our algorithm to look for those personalities, those behaviors that drive success specifically within our business, but
yeah.
also those motivators that are indicators of success. So that removes a lot of bias just by the nature of how we've trained it. But if I go back to those four stages, I think the big thing for us was how it helps reduce bias in the actual interview process. So typically in a sales or recruitment role, your managers will be like, I want somebody that's really competitive.
Mm.
They played team sports at university, and actually being able to look at behind that, what does that mean? Is that
Yeah.
goal orientation? Is that self motivation? Is that a growth mindset? Being able to pull those natural behaviors and drivers out, and be able to show that to a hiring manager alongside a CV if necessary. We actually don't even include CVs in a lot of our specs into our hiring managers.
Amazing. Yeah.
It's based off their assess first match. It really helps them. But I think actually going back to something you said, Lauren, about diversity training can sometimes be quite short lived and not embedding. I think you're almost training them to use language, and language I think for me is so important with gender bias. So you're almost
Mm,
giving them exposure to gender neutral language all the
yeah.
time.
Mm,
So they're starting to look at, not if they're competitive, but actually if they're goal orientated instead.
hmm.
And on the summary report that you get with AssessFirst, there are actually suggested interview questions as well. It's saying, don't implicitly trust the results of, the algorithm 100%, go in and
Hmm.
dive deeper. And that was feedback from my managers, they found those questions really helpful because
Yeah.
generally people have a list of questions and they ask the
Yeah.
same in, and it just gives them a different way in to like finding the answers for things like resilience, right? Like that
Hmm.
that bounce back ability, and being able to look at those things I think really has helped us quite dramatically, with taking the bias out of the interview process itself.
Hmm.
And I think, and I don't know if we go into this now or a little bit later, but when you're talking about that access or that, we call it the broken rung, right? So even if you're
Hmm.
hiring the same amount of people at an entry level, it doesn't translate through promotions. And for me,
Yeah.
it's you have to balance talent acquisition with retention because in
Hmm.
theory, so I just saw that question from Kelly there. I mean, sales and recruitment is a heavily male dominated environment. We were talking about this earlier at a company I used to work for. There were 48 Jameses just in one division. So it's definitely a huge issue in our industry as well. And for me, that theory of the broken rung is that you have to hire way above 50% in order to get you to that balance at the top. And in practice, that's we're all still striving to get the 50%, right? So it's actually thinking about how you can use AI in your retention strategy. So it is things like removing that affinity bias as well, where sometimes thinks I have to hire somebody like me in order to manage somebody like me to develop them, and being able to use like the affinity and the leadership mapper and assess first, or the talent mapper to show that diversity, because I think diversity is sometimes a scary topic to talk about. I mean, I talk about it all the time. I don't find it scary, but lots of people find it scary. And ultimately, the reason why you want diversity in your workforce, apart from it being the right thing to do, is it's that diversity of thought, right? That's what breeds, and is
Yeah,
proven to breed additional success and commerciality. And that's
yeah,
why taking people from different backgrounds, socioeconomic, religion, race, country, whatever it may be, being able to use that talent mapper and actually seeing where you've got gaps in your business, that
yeah,
applying that same like gap analysis knowledge you would use from a commercial standpoint actually to the makeup of your hiring team.
yeah,
This is where AI can be incredibly useful in
yeah.
kind of getting rid of those biases, not just in the recruitment process, but how you're even thinking to build out teams. And that's
Mhm.
based off, the model we use currently in AssessFirst that is built off AI and our team, and matching those personality traits and their drivers, and then building that into models.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the thing, like what you touched on there about generally the bias is existing because of generalizations. And we look at the CV as an example, like it's an easy way to categorize people, but by ultimately categorizing people and screening people in, we're actually removing the opportunity for people to be considered. So the more we can personalize our processes and use technology and AI to create a process that is specifically looking at the individual in front of us and considering what part of their makeup, which when we look at personality based algorithms, what we're considering is identifying their personality traits, decision making processes, and motivations that are distinctive and consistent in this person, that are, we know through conducting or creating benchmarks on what good looks like internally, we know are required for success. Now, the reason this isn't just substituting one bias for another is because personality is gender blind ultimately. So when we're looking at facets of personality, you don't see that some personality traits are more present in one gender or one ethnicity than another. They are equally distributed and equally representative. The challenge is that people don't have an equal opportunity to present those personality facets or motivations in an equal manner because the bias prevents them from being selected. And this is why, when we look at CVs, if you have two candidates with equal CVs with two different names, it is likely that one of those names would be more likely to be considered because a bias is existing, basically, that prevents the other from being considered equally. So that's really what we're looking at here. It's about using technology to our advantage to get better diversity and equal representation in our teams, but also to mean these processes are actually higher quality for our candidates, which leads us on to AI and the candidate experience. It has so much value to add when used at the correct stage for our process, as Aasha mentioned. There are lots of organizations who are struggling with way too many candidates. And if there's an opportunity for a solution to give you access to the top candidates within your talent pool who are the best suited based on these gender blind kind of selecting tools, I guess, or selecting behaviors such as personality and motivations, you are then going to reduce your time to hire, improve the candidate experience, and get access to the best candidates that have the highest suitability for the role quicker. But also, we need to balance that with making sure the process is as personalized as possible. So, lots of candidates, organizations do choose to have like an initial screening call and then administer AssessFirst, so that they've had that touch in the initial place, in the initial point of the process. But that really depends on you. Like that's the beauty of this. It can fit where you need it to. But ultimately, the crucial part is giving the right inputs and making sure the data is accurate. Um, More research very recently has shown that actually algorithm driven hiring, these processes can be seen as less fair than those conducted by humans. And that is a perception in the space. But ultimately, there's a part missing from this annoyingly, but the thing that changes that is when they are given the information. If you're explaining to your candidates the value that can be brought in by algorithms being part of your process, if they are educated on the fact that actually this does help reduce bias, that massively changes the way in which algorithms and AI driven hiring are being perceived by our candidates. And that's where we as recruiters have a responsibility to inform, and to educate people in our processes as to, yes, how their data is being handled, but also the value and benefit of having these things in processes, and why they are better suited for them. More recent research shows that women are more likely to complete assessments and interviews when they know the evaluation is conducted by an unbiased algorithm rather than a human recruiter, which touches on the point we made at the very start. People know, and women in particular know, that they are more likely to be judged fairly and equally when there is a technology solution in place. So actually, there can be a lot of value added to increase reputations, and especially if you're in a particularly male-dominated environment. We see this even in schools when we're trying to really push women into STEM subjects. If women and girls know that they have a better opportunity for being considered, and they know that you're an organization that's really prioritizing equal and fair hiring practices, this is a great way of attracting more relevant candidates to your organization, and has the possibility to increase intent for these people to continue through the selection process as well. And I'm sure, Aasha, for you, as you've mentioned, you're working in a very male-dominated environment, but the data shows you've got 30% more females, 22% overall more general diversity, an increase in female representation at senior level, then that is proof of the pudding, right? That's got the opportunity to make those changes at senior level.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's all how you drive it internally, right? You do need your champions. And interestingly, I just wanted to comment. I saw something pop up around like the neurodiversity piece. I myself am neurodiverse, and actually, when I was not even in Spencer Ogden, but in my previous company, looking at assessment providers, it was like a key thing for me that I really wanted to make sure that we were using a solution that took that into account, but also a global solution that could be done in multiple languages. I think often when I would say, like, take the test in the language your brain thinks in, again, because sometimes if people are using their second language, there are just translation or comprehension things that come up. So I think that is really important. But yeah, as you said, the proof is in the pudding. I think that was within 18 to 24 months that had already shown that quite dramatic increase. And from a blind test point of view, I think specifically at Spencer Ogden, that was the only thing that was changed in the hiring process. So it was quite clear that it linked back to how we used and embedded it into our hiring processes.
And just a question from Mark, I can see. Sorry, guys, the chat is pretty busy. There isn't a worry about hiring clones by hiring through personality assessments. Ironically, referrals have been the more common hiring manner, which is more likely to hire people that are the same as the people that recommend them due to the way we create our social groups. But the key thing to remember here is that personality traits, as I mentioned, they aren't you don't only get men who are competitive, and this is the whole point about being aware of the language that we're using. People from all different parts of the population, different genders, ages, ethnicities, have the equal opportunity to display the personality traits that are required for success within your role. So by removing a biased lens in the way that we look at these people, such as CVs, such as just conducting a simple interview, we give people who have those personality traits. For example, this could be, you may need people who are particularly assertive. You may need people who are particularly able to adapt to change, particularly pragmatic, have a super high attention to detail. These are the traits that we basically examine within our assessment. So you're not doing a hiring more people like us approach. That's not what assessments are doing. They are finding the people that have the same collective ways of approaching a problem, the same collective motivations that are already existing within your team. So you're still allowing much, much more diversity overall, but you're kind of being more particular about the personality traits and motivations that allow people to succeed within your organization.
Yeah, and if I can speak on that as well, like I think when I said about the gap analysis, so interestingly, and again, I guess a real world example. So I mentioned already that, in Germany, you can't just use AI as the only tool. And, our German business was outperforming actually the rest of the global business quite significantly in my last company, and they'd really taken the assessment tool, as I said, further, and they'd used that talent mapping, and they were actually looking at, so the key one that you said then, that's what made me think of it, was that adaptability to change. They realized they had a real gap across their entire leadership team for like that particular personality traits. And so when they were interviewing and looking at CVs, we were looking at people that had that in a really strong way, so that we could build that diversity into the team. I think, especially in this day and age where the world is so up and down, like that's a key skill that potentially before in sales and recruitment wasn't that important. It's kind
Mm,
of just doing the same thing over and over again. So actually, it's like anything, it's how you use the tool and how you train people to
exactly.
use the tool.
Yeah.
So, we were really able to take that, and and every manager was sitting down and looking at their team makeup and being like, right, okay, where are the key bits where I have like a total gap and there's no one in my team that does this? Like, how
Hmm.
do we look for candidates? How do we look for candidates? How do we
Hmm.
screen for this?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm super happy this has caused a conversation. We knew this would be a very kind of interesting topic for people to explore, and having these conversations is super useful. So thank you so much, everybody. And if everyone's got any additional questions, do pop them into the chat. The final thing that we wanted to touch on, which is more about the overall candidate experience, is candidate feedback. So again, when we're looking at understanding someone's personality traits, motivations, and decision making abilities, and the way they make decisions, it also gives us access to where they don't have such a high alignment to our organization. And when we go back to the very start of the statistics, when we see that women are often perceived and judged more harshly than men are in an interview process and in a position, by having an objective approach and impression of these people's profiles, it gives us a way to equally make sure that we're considering someone's lack of alignment. We can take that data fairly into an interview, use things like the interview questions to mean that we get an equal way of considering strengths and weaknesses for a candidate as well. So the candidate that comes away from this process being like, actually, yeah, you know what? This person's looked into where I possibly don't have a perfect alignment to this position. We've talked about it, we've overcome it. And then, of course, from our perspective, internally, we have this data to then help this candidate once they are in the organization. So we have these things in place to support them with L&D from the very start. And if the candidate isn't selected because there is too much of a misalignment, the candidate can then be told, very clearly and very fairly and neutrally, where their profile isn't an amazing fit for the organization, or the way I like to word it is where the organization isn't going to optimize their most natural talents. Which ultimately means they've got this more objective data to take forward and support them in where they go next.
If I
Sorry,
can just
Aasha.
add on to that, Lauren, quickly,
Yeah,
I think
please.
candidate experience is one of the most. I mean, for all of us on this call, I would imagine as TAs and in-house recruitment, it's such a big metric. And if I take off my TA hat for a moment and put my job seeker hat on, I was made redundant back in January, and I think in total I did over 300 applications, of which something like 250 were just like auto AI rejects from some big name
Wow.
companies who talk about their diversity and their inclusion and in their process. It was pretty crazy. And I think, that definitely had a lens coming in here about how I wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So I think that feedback is really useful for somebody, especially again in the early career space. But generally, like, when you don't get any feedback, it's super frustrating. But also, I think, as you pointed out there, I think going into an interview, a manager is armed with that information and they can dive into it. It might be, and I definitely see it a lot, like there is sometimes like a lack of confidence or a lack of ability to speak about key drivers or motivations, but with the manager having, or the interviewer having that information in front of them,
Mm-hmm.
regardless if that can the gender of that candidate, they can look at, actually, these are some of the misalignments. This is definitely something, resilience, for instance, that being able to handle that day in, day out, near constant
Mm-hmm.
rejection, might not come up on a CV, or somebody might not be able to talk about it. But if somebody is presenting as being very confident, then, the natural bias is they're going to be able to do that. But actually, if you've got that on black and white in front of you, and you can dive into that either way, from a yes, it's a really strong affinity, or no, it's not a strong affinity. It
Hmm.
just gives you that basis for having those, what we call it, like adult conversations with somebody, like
Exactly.
this isn't going to fit your natural strengths, what you like to do, what
Yeah.
motivates and drives you,
Yeah.
so on
Yeah.
that cold November morning when it's pouring with rain and you haven't done your first deal and everybody else has,
Yeah. Yeah.
why are you going to stay, and just having
Exactly.
those conversations and be able to like give that to a candidate. I think
Hmm.
it's really, really important. It's very powerful as well. We get a lot of
Yeah.
people. So going back to the referrals, we get a lot of people now who we reject that refer people to the business. And for me, that's like
Yes.
a really key indicator that we're doing something right in terms of
Yeah.
our candidate experience.
Yeah. And also, like, let's normalize not being perfect. And I think this is a huge thing for hiring managers. They will be so quick to reject candidates based on one thing that doesn't align perfectly with their profile. Taking that back to gender, are women more likely to be rejected because of this one thing? But actually, if we've got this neutral data, we're giving more opportunity for people to be selected, but also to go, look, we can work past one area of
Mhm.
misalignment, two areas of misalignment. Charlie, I would often say something like, we go through the profile, we'd say, look, there are two key parts of your personality makeup that don't align. We're looking for someone who, as an example, is particularly detail oriented, whereas your results show that you're more of a big picture thinker. You're able to take all parts of a project into consideration and focus your talents where necessary, whereas we really need for this accountant position someone who's very attention detail oriented. Ultimately, what this suggests is that this organization isn't going to utilize your natural talents in the best way. You would be much better suited to a position or an organization that will make the most of your ability to be this big picture thinker, for example. So yeah, that would be how I'd phrase it. Basically, we as an organization aren't the best place to optimize your natural talents and motivators.